Attention, attention please. Stand by for another episode of
When Humanists Attack.
Welcome to another episode of When Humanists Attack. I am your host today, Vincent Downing, and I have the very distinct honor and pleasure of introducing and interviewing our very own resident Jewish Taoist Pagan, Roger Kimmel Smith, who was one of the masterminds or ringleaders of a Temple of the Apotheosis, which was, as you may or may not know, the precursor to When Humanists Attack. As a friend of mine said to me the other day when I was explaining this project to them, he said, "Oh, so you're picking up from where you left off back in the late 90s. And I said, yes, and hopefully have learned a thing or two. So that, as well as what we may have learned in the intervening time, is what I'm going to be talking to Mr. Smith about today. Welcome to the show, Roger. It's good to be talking to you again. And I'd like to first get a quick recap on what it is you're up to these days.
A pleasure to be with you, Vincent. In 2020, I am living in upstate New York, rural outskirts of Ithaca, in a hamlet called Brooktondale. I have been making a living as a freelance educational wordsmith, writer, and editor for a decade or more, writing about things ranging from business to politics, current events, jazz, the history of show business, and Black history. I host a radio program on a local community station out of Ithaca and Watkins Glen, New York, called Crazy Words, Crazy Tune, that airs weekly and focuses on music and popular culture of the 1920s and 1930s, a passion of mine. In recent days, I've been working part-time at a job that was declared essential once COVID-19 struck, which is stocking groceries at the Green Star Food Co-op in Ithaca, New York.
Well, it sounds like you're still busy.
Some of my current pursuits. Let's go back to the fall of 1996, when a Temple of the Apotheosis attempted probably its most ambitious program, a weekly gathering in the East Village, which we called the Congress of Causation.
Yeah.
We were youthful ne'er-do-wells or do-gooders or both, trying to make something happen. I had a little FCC thought. Should I or should I not, tell the truth? What we were trying to make happen was shit. We were making shit happen. We didn't quite know what it would be. What the Congress of Causation turned out to cause in my life around 1998 was a relationship, essentially, with the woman who became my wife, became the mother of my child, and then a decade or more later became my ex-wife. And perhaps a few other things I daren't say. When you start meddling, I remember one Vincent Downing saying around that time, we're trying to take the bold step from dabbling to meddling. And when you do that, my good man, you do not know what will result.
What the result will be.
So yeah, that new relationship, which was immensely exciting to me at its outset, which seemed really in my heart of hearts to be a reward for the good work that I had done both on myself and in the community with you guys. The reward was this relationship, which blossomed into marriage, although it did, as a cost of preserving the relationship, as became more and more clear later on, but should have been clear from the beginning, it cost me my working relationship with you guys. Because she tended not to like almost anyone. It was strange that she liked me. That's when I started to pull away.
Interesting. Okay.
So I had already sort of concluded my pulling away by '98 when we called ATOTA a day.
Officially, yeah.
But I was still then living in New York and working at the UN and wanting to teach. I had started taking education credits, and I ended up getting a high school teaching job in 2000, but not completing the year because I despised many elements of teaching high school. Did several years of college teaching, part-time and full-time, all as adjunct. And during that phase of my stabs at professional careers, my ex and I moved up to Ithaca, and also during that time had a child. Magda's now 18, so that's another of my greatest accomplishments.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Now, speaking of which, let's go back to where we were, what we were doing, and maybe some of the things we learned back then. You were saying earlier that you didn't think that we accomplished a great deal. I'd have to disagree. I'd have to say that in terms of our intentions, we really, in some ways, we really missed the mark incredibly. But in terms of other things, in terms of like learning how not to do certain things, I think we got a great deal done. Well, what was your understanding of what we were doing? Maybe start as close to the beginning as you think relates to what we're doing right now.
When I returned to my hometown of Brooklyn in 1993 from a few sort of misspent youth years in San Francisco, and swiftly through the workings of fate, I found my way to living with Robin and Andrea in Park Slope, and through Robin meeting you and Chris. Very soon after that, I was invited by you to a gathering / happening / party / celebration of the autumn equinox of that year. A very fun time was had, and I discovered that, the two of you and some of your compatriots had a footing in the pagan ceremonial rites and some of the sort of, cultural precepts surrounding that. You knew how to stage a ceremony with sufficient pomp and a sense that that energy was a currency that we could gather. We could, cast a magic circle, at least do the business of saying hello and thank you to some elementals that were out in the beyond. All this was somewhat impressive to me. I didn't have experience with it, but by the end of not that night, but more events that were the 8 ceremonies of the year, the 2 solstices, the 2 equinoxes, the 4 points in between. I learned this to be a pagan cycle of holidays, which really made sense to me. And the group, it seems, maybe after that autumn equinox, or maybe after the Halloween that followed it, or Samhain. I never learned how to pronounce the names of these holidays really correctly. But at some point during that first, half year, I think really you and Chris, maybe me and Robin, were drawn in, committed to continuing the year and staging events in NYC for all 8 of those spokes on the wheel. For years, I thought this was our main pragmatic accomplishment, is that we actually did follow through with that, not just for 1 year, but for 4 whole years of homegrown pagan-esque celebrations / ceremonies in the proper balance of reverence and irreverence. Actually is accomplishing a lot and drawing in a few dozen people, which sometimes seemed like, it was on the upper end of a few dozen, who came to the events and were parts of a network or a constituency. There was a churchy type word we were tempted to call it.
Congregation?
Yeah.
And we kept picking up more people all the time. We were good at that. And
Right.
I say that because recently I've not been good at that. So I recognize the accomplishment now that I was taking for granted.
Out of the air, out of the zeitgeist of New York City in the mid 90s, we were, drawing a recognition of that need, a need for networking within the larger urban space or community building within it, subcultural as it may be. We were all proud weirdos,
Counterculturalists, actually, in a way.
counterculturalists.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And
more.
I never really got immersed in the magic with a K kind of business. I had sympathy for friends who sometimes referred derisively to the Chris and Vincent religion, but I knew that you and we were onto something. I think that the way you're articulating it now has more maturity to it.
Our biggest single weakness was trying to build a community without depending on the us versus them dynamic. And that was actually one of our very clearly articulated goals right from the start. We did not want to have, one of these situations where we are the good people and all those other people around us are the bad people.
I guess the pagans, the historical record shows that we're more like the Jews, comfortable being on the receiving end of persecution than meeting it out. Taoists perhaps the same, still more gently.
We managed to get some fairly disparate types of people to get along very well.
An occupational hazard of the countercultural, magical weirdo basket of individuals is they're so proud of their individualism that they may not even notice that they're partaking in mighty helpings of the same kind of individualism, which is actually one of the main things harming us as a national society, as a set of Americans. We're harmed by our individualism and don't naturally form communities that make a concrete, pragmatic difference in one another's lives, that help people grow, help people build a base under their hierarchy of needs so that they can aim higher in what they intend to and commit to achieving while alive. Other societies do that better than we do. Mutual aid and solidarity, something that I think people in our general subculture are coming back to during this time, because we overall have been kicked down the hierarchy of needs, so the needs are more intense, so we're responding to them as best we can. We also had ideas about participating in spiritual life through this project, and not in an us and them way, but not in the usual Western way.
Or the usual Eastern way, then, if we're doing without an us versus them, I mean, that seems to be fairly baked into just about all of these communities, regardless of where they originate. That's one of the things that leaders and people count on. Under certain circumstances, I don't even consider it a bad thing. Consider how you would need an opposing team. Think about in sports. You need teams to be in opposition to your team so that you'll be better at your sport.
That's right. What were they? The Washington, the ones the Harlem Globetrotters always knocked off. They certainly served the whole in their function.
So I think we actually succeeded in that. I think we succeeded in being entertaining. We certainly, at the Congress of Causation, we had a lot of really talented and driven to communicate. I can't, there were so many different people trying to do so many different things. You had people doing magical rituals. You had people showing their art. You had people doing bits of Shakespeare. You kind of never really knew what was going to happen when people stepped up to that microphone.
Right, and sometimes it flopped, as you know, as any good
sure.
as any good comedy stage will witness its share of flops. But offering the stage, you know, the chutzpah that I guess it took for us as a group to propose and then realize the whole idea of it. It seemed on one level like a next step that made sense. The energy that we had drawn together in these 8 gatherings a year was delicious enough that we wanted more of it, which is how I thought of it. The service that we saw it providing was one we thought we could harness and take to another level. So it made sense to do a weekly program. But it essentially, like your idea here for a program, it has many of the same qualities, many of the same requirements as entertainment programming, as I suppose churches and synagogues have to fill a certain amount of time per week as well, you know, with their content.
And be entertaining and have a good feed afterwards, and have a place where you can leave the kids so the parents get a little bit of resting time. I've actually learned a lot about all of that at the Society of Ethical Culture, which has a lot of very practical matters that have to be attended to, along with teaching people about ethics and teaching children how to be ethical members of our species rather than the cute little savages that they otherwise are. We were a bunch of young folks. There were no kids at the time. We were all at least
imagine if somebody had brought a kid to one of those congresses.
It happened a couple of times. It was, I remember it once being not that disruptive, but it was disruptive because we really did not have, you know, this is a bunch of 20 somethings, basically. We really didn't have there wasn't any childcare space. I don't
think I had ever held a baby until I had one.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
The one my sister had 3 months before my ex had Magda.
Well, that was a good thing to learn how to do in your
of some practical value.
Humanification there. Given that it was pretty cerebral, much of it, and it was pretty cerebral. Like, do you remember the sleepover weekend where we did like the retreat, and we all slept in the temple in the basement at my house, and we meditated on what we wanted the group to be?
You bet I remember that. You know, that was the one and only time really that I passed up an opportunity to go sleep with another person in the same bed. An opportunity I had not had for years. It's part of why I ended up pulling away. But yes, I do remember that weekend.
I don't remember there being a set thinker that we all had to agree on, for example. We were trying to do what we were doing without that. We certainly weren't asking everybody to be a pagan. We wanted people to do the pagan rituals, but as you pointed out,
the overriding concept was interfaith.
Humanism without the name. When I encountered humanism as a philosophy some years afterwards, I was like, oh, well, you know, that's what we were trying to do with ATOTA. That's what we woulda, shoulda, coulda called it if I'd have even really known that it was out there to be had. And I didn't find that it was a problem for the interfaith concept, that we were using the pagan rituals as the operating framework. Everybody brought all kinds of different things into the pagan rituals and added them, and nobody was saying, well, you know, the goddess wouldn't like that or anything like that. So I think that worked out. How did you put it earlier?
There had to be a proper balance of reverence and irreverence. Or I would run screaming, as I have from some pagan events I've gone to in other settings, that it's very easy for that stuff to gross me out. if it takes itself too seriously. Humor is one of the fundamental philosophies. The tactics that we felt were most likely to work for us and perhaps have most impact were like those of street theater. A humorous, irreverent take that also sort of indirectly spoke of solidarity and of the need for social, cultural, and political change, but expressed through humor, through cosplay, through showing up and breaking the spell of capitalist reality. We were trying to do that in general, but had a few successful moments. We had the Congress of Causation in the Brett Schneider Funeral Home for a few months in really the fall semester of 2016, of that election year. So it coincided with our seasonal rites only a couple of times. We did Halloween of 1996 in the funeral home. Had me showing up a good 20, 30 minutes before the starting time of the event, sitting in the front pew and crying my eyes out.
Yeah.
We were finally, after weeks of having congresses of causation and, zany open mic spiritual variety show in the funeral home, we were finally having a funeral. Staging a funeral. And so you gave the eulogy, one of your more memorable performances, and in keeping with the greater meaning of the season, the late harvest that Samhain season represents. The funeral was 4 parts, elements of ourselves, to which it was time to say goodbye.
We had that coffin right under the lectern for the funeral person who would give the address. We didn't let anybody in the audience see what was in the coffin. We had it. It was a closed coffin during the actual ceremony. We had you staged there in the front.
Oh, I think those are much
crying
more
your eyes out. So everybody comes in and it's like, and we had us dressed somberly, ushering them into their seats, and it was all very atypical of the usual Congress of Causation, let me tell you. And everybody was kind of like all kind of, rung up and wondering what was going to be happening. And it was just this coffin up there. And it wasn't really a real coffin. It was just this cardboard thing. But
I was really crying.
You were really crying, and we were really acting like it was a real funeral. And we were in a funeral home, and it was just very tense there. And then the eulogy, and then we opened the coffin and let everybody come up and give their respects. And what was in the coffin was a dummy, just newspapers in this set of clothes. It looked convincingly like a human form. And in the place of a head, there was the mirror. And you were supposed to go up, look into the mirror, and see that you were letting go of a part of yourself. The only part of that I remember really clearly was going up in the middle and clutching my chest and sobbing and saying, "He was so handsome," and then rushing back to my seat. And then all the people who had already been up to the coffin burst into laughter. And the people who were still waiting in their seats to go up to the coffin were more confused than ever. That really was one of our most successful.
Well, I'll divulge the thing that I ended up realizing that I was crying about. The thing I was saying goodbye to at that time was my singleness.
Oh, something to weep over, certainly, even in the best of times.
For sure. And had I only known.
We did some really, really good street theater. And we did some really great neighborhood theater. Maybe you could count it as street theater. I remember in the park when we were doing the rituals and people would send their kids over to hang out with us and wave the incense and chant.
It all consisted of that. Right, which why it had to have an element of reverence. It couldn't all be silly.
Right.
Right. That is the magic. That's the magic consists of, surfing that
balance,
that line. Yeah.
That was very well put. I'm going to give that one a great deal more thought for our endeavor here.
That's the yin yang balance that draws me to thinking that of the organized religious traditions, the Taoist one is the one that's easiest to swallow, easiest to take, and seems to make the most empirical sense. As for Jewish, you were hinting at asking, and I'll just say simply that I include it because I want to honor and I don't want to dishonor the heritage that's ancestral and that's ethnic. But I think of my Jewishness as principally an ethnicity, and perhaps equally a style of humor and of culture, more than of religion. But it has that flavor, so it works well, in that balance. My ethnicity is Jewish, my philosophy is Taoist, my practice, to the extent I have one, has been pagan. It felt very much like I had one during those years. I think the reason I continue to associate myself a Taoist, not so much because I groove to the truths and the manifestations and the mysteries in Lao Tzu, but because I really gravitate to Zhuangzi's brilliance in getting across spiritual content through humorous vignettes, which are really quite funny.
What is it that you would like to accomplish with what we're doing now? What would be your idea as to a worthy goal?
I adore and think there are great possibilities in this idea of developing media content, sound bites, and humorous video imagery that brings an underlying message that we put under the branch of humanism. What's that? And describe as an attack. What's that? I think it really contains all of the threads that we brought up in this conversation from that work. The use of humor, the call to a higher self-criticism, mental functionism, cultural criticism, and self-actualization.
That's something that I'm still highly focused in on with our sub group, the Ethics Lab, which is section of When Humanists Attack that's more focused in on what I like to call the mental tinkering part of the game. As you articulated in another way, where we're looking at personal growth and we're looking at social progress. I don't want us to overlook either one of those things in what we're promulgating or
personal growth amid apocalypse.
Yeah. I would like to thank all of you for giving us your valuable time and watching another episode of When Humanists Attack.